We're going to pick up where we left off in the book of Ruth, chapter 2 now. We finished chapter 1, and we looked as Naomi and Ruth have made their way to Bethlehem, and the hand of God had now provided for his people again, filling up that house of bread. And today we're going to be introduced to another player in this story, but you know, for a few decades now, it seems like the prevailing question of culture is, where have all the good men gone? If you want proof, I've got it for you. In 1984, there was a movie released called Footloose, and you may have or may not have heard of that movie. Well, on the soundtrack for that movie, there's a song by a female artist named Bonnie Tyler called Holding Out for a Hero, where the literal first line of that song asks that exact question. Now, I want to read for you the chorus of that song because I think it sets up chapter 2 perfectly for us. Miss Tyler sings, "I need a hero. I'm holding out for a hero to the end of the night. He's got to be strong, he's got to be fast, and he's got to be fresh from the fight. I need a hero. I'm holding out for a hero till the morning light. He's got to be sure, he's got to be soon, and he's got to be larger than life." And picking up where we left off in the book of Ruth, there's a sense that Naomi and Ruth are both looking for what Bonnie Tyler was looking for too. Naomi's empty and bitter. Ruth is in an entirely new culture, a new land, and as we'll see, is consistently reminded of her otherness. There's a hero that's needed. We're kind of at that point in this literary love story where, you know, we have these damsels in distress. And so in chapter 2, we enter Boaz. And we're going to look in the first couple of verses first about his character. In chapter 2, verse 1, it says this: "Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz." And actually, in the literary sense and the way that this story reads, this verse is kind of an anomaly in the sense that it doesn't seem to fit. After leaving chapter 1, verse 22, where it talks about the barley harvest had begun, we go right into, here's this relative of Naomi's. And it doesn't fit. And as we continue to read the story, we're going to see that this verse actually fits a little bit better after verse 3. But nonetheless, we are introduced to Boaz in this moment. We are introduced to a figure in this story that's going to become the central figure of this story. Now, the story's named for Ruth. There's no doubt about that, because it is through her that this mosaic of God's sovereignty is working, through her circumstances and the kindness that is shown from her, but also to her. And most of that kindness shown to her is through this man, Boaz. Now, what's important to note about in this verse, verse 1, is it sets up immediately the type of man that Boaz is. It says that he is a worthy man. You know, as a man, character matters. As a man, who you are is most important. And this word worthy here means of great stature, potentially of good wealth as well. But he's moral, he's upright. This is the type of man that enters into the scene of Ruth, chapter 2. His name is Boaz, and it's one that we're going to need to remember. Boaz is a name that we want to remember because it is one that's going to play an integral role to this story, especially in these next few verses where there's an encounter. In chapter 2, verses 2 through 7, we read this: "And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, 'Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor.'" Remember that word. "And she said to her, 'Naomi, go, my daughter.' So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. So it was the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' And they answered, 'The Lord bless you.' Then Boaz said to his young men who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." There's a lot going on in these very few verses, and the reason that this is so beautiful of a picture for us to see is found right there in verse 3. In verse 3, it recounts for us that Ruth so happened to find herself in the field of Boaz. And when we're talking about the sovereignty of God and this beautiful mosaic and pieces that are imperfectly shaped but perfectly put together, we see the hand of God working in the book of Ruth. This just so happened is an idiom in the Hebrew language that reveals to us that there's more going on than that the actual players of the story know. It just so happened that Ruth was in the field of Boaz, but in the eternal realm of things, there was no happening. It was ordained. And it's one of those situations where God has placed Ruth directly in front of the person who will move this story and his story along. Now, Ruth has set out this plan for herself because her and Naomi have come back from Moab, but they don't necessarily have provisions for themselves. They know that the Lord is working in Bethlehem and that the Lord has provided in Bethlehem, but they still have to find provisions for themselves. And what she suggests to herself to do to Naomi is to go and to glean in the fields. Now, this was an ancient practice of taking care of the poor and the widowed. What would happen is you would have the reapers working out in a field. They'd be bringing in the harvest. We know that right now at this time in the story is the barley harvest. So they would go and they would harvest. And what would happen is as they were gathering their grain and as they were gathering their harvest, there would be some that would be left on the outside of the field or in the corners of the field, kind of the lesser quality products, but it would be left for the gleaners. And the gleaners would come behind the reapers and they would gather up whatever they could gather up that could sustain them for just a little while. And Ruth in this moment is a gleaner. Ruth in this moment becomes one of these people who are behind the reapers gathering food. And Boaz, being the owner of the field, gives us a little clue into who he is, not only his character as verse 1 described, but also his societal standing. Boaz owns the field. Boaz doesn't work in the field. Boaz owns the field. He's the one that has people working the field for him. And so he comes into the field, and as he comes into the field, he greets his employees by saying, "The Lord bless you." And then they respond, "And God bless you as well." And this clues us in a little bit to the time period where we're at, right? If you remember back to our first study in chapter 1, we know that we're in the time of Judges. And that time of Judges was a moment of chaos because in between Judges, men did what was right in their own eyes. And we said that that could be a reason why there was a previous famine in Bethlehem. But now we have a picture of Israelite people who are being faithful to God. Potentially a reason why the famine was lifted to begin with. But we have Boaz who is representing in this moment not only a worthy man like verse 1 says, but also a faithful man. Imagine, if you will, walking into your job and your boss greeting you by going, "God bless you today." How would that change your workday? But that's how Boaz greets his employees here. And then not only that, as Boaz is moving throughout his field, his eye catches on to a particular gleaner in that field. And as every man asked, and we can assume there was a bit of a double look, if you will. As he made that double look, he asked the man that works for him, he said, "Who's that one over there? Who's that one? That girl right there?" And the man responds, he says, "That is the Moabite." Again, kind of showing that otherness of Ruth. She's not one of us. She's a Moabite. But she's the one that came back from Moab with Naomi. And in that moment, the man relays to her, she's been here since the morning. She's only taken a short rest, but she is here in our field working. And in this moment, we see kind of the favor of Boaz and the kindness of Boaz that he's going to show to Ruth. It's in chapter 2, verse 18 through 16. And this is how the story proceeds. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go and glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and your mother and your native land and have come to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my lord, for you have comforted me and spoke kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." And at mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed her roasted grain. And she sat until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. And when she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some of the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." We have such a beautiful picture here of the type of man that we should strive to be. See, Boaz here meets this foreign woman who's down on her luck, who has no provisions, and he takes favor upon her. This word favor here is the same type of word that we use for grace. He extends grace to her. You know, a very common definition of grace is getting what you don't deserve. In this moment, Ruth recognizes who she is. She says, "I'm a foreigner, and I am your servant." She has lowered herself on the societal scale to that of even a slave, hoping that Boaz would take kindness on her, hoping that Boaz would, in that moment, show her some favor. And it pays off, because he does. In fact, he does so much for her that he not only allows her to glean in his field, but he ensures her protection by telling the young man, "Do not even touch her." And then he goes a step farther and says, "You know what? We're all sitting down for dinner. Why don't you come and join us too? And eat what you want, and dip your bread in this wine, and eat until you're satisfied." And Ruth does. He extends this hand of grace to her. And then, not only that, he goes another step farther. And he tells his young men that are in charge of the field, he says, "Let her glean and do not rebuke her, but also take some of the good stuff out of the barrel. Take some of the good stuff out of the bag and lay it before her so she can glean that too. And make sure that she's taken care of." Man, Boaz and his character, he being a worthy man, is something to strive for. There's a massive implication of application for us here today, specifically for us men here today. And that application comes from the person of who Boaz is. It should be noted that Boaz is one of the few biblical characters that never has a negative thing said about him. It's important. So let's look at this application and what we can learn from who Boaz is, specifically as it relates to being a good man. Boaz has never had anything negatively said about him in this story up until this point, because he's only been introduced today, but he's not going to have anything negative said about him, and he's one of the few biblical characters that will. And so as we look at how can I be a good man, I think there's a few things that we can learn from Boaz. First of all, Boaz was faithful. We're in a time of Judges where, again, the summary of Judges is found in the last verse, where there was no king in the land and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And Boaz greets his people in the name of Yahweh. He's faithful. The rest of the country may be in chaos, but Boaz knows where to look. Boaz knows who his God is. He's faithful. And that sets an example for his workers as well, because they respond to him in the same type of way. But not only is Boaz faithful to who God is, Boaz is also a man of good character. He's moral. He's he's built a business that has people working for him, and by all accounts, and coming out of a famine, is a business that is successful. But he's not getting that successful business by shady practices, because he's a worthy man. He's an upright and stand-up kind of guy. His character matters. They often say that character is what you do when no one is around. How's our character? How's our character? Third, a good man protects. There was no reason why Boaz had to look out for Ruth. First of all, she's a woman in that culture. Let's be very clear about that. She's a woman. She's a foreigner, and she has no societal standing at all. But yet he protects her, and he knows that in that moment, she is potentially a target. She's in the field, she's by herself. There could be a sense or feeling that no one's going to miss her, so she could be an easy target for a type of predator. And I'm sure a lot of that went on. But Boaz, being the man of character that he is and faithful to his God, also looked out for those that needed looked out for. He stood up and he said, I'm in charge of this field and no one's to lay a hand on her. But then the fourth thing that we see is that he also provided. It was his field. It was his harvest. It was his dinner table and his food that was offered at that dinner table that he did not have to invite Ruth to, but he did. He just had met her that day. Now, there's nothing necessarily romantic about it, but in this moment, he said, you have nothing, I have something. Why don't you come and partake in what I have? And he invites her to the dinner table. And what's so interesting in this moment about her, this gleaner, this foreigner, this person who's demoted herself to the position of a slave in his field, he's invited her to his table and essentially elevated her societal status. Ruth the Moabite, the foreigner, is how she's often referred to in this story thus far. But he's elevated her to a position of someone who would be like a sojourner, or somebody who's accepted within society and taken care of by society, not somebody on the outskirts of it. And so if we're to look at the character of Boaz and take any type of application from him, it's that we must be people, and men specifically, who are faithful, who are of good character, who are protectors, and who are providers. And if we do that, well, maybe we answer the question of where have all the good men gone? They're right here. They're men of good character. They're men who are faithful to God. They're men who protect. They're men who provide. That's the answer to the question that was asked a few decades ago.